cortex. That's what we're focusing on. And I actually wanted to kind of have my starting point and Mazviita's starting point. It's kind of, there is a controversy going on. So I will try to map sort of in the simplifying way the controversy and ask, is it really a controversy? And the way Mazviita reconstructs it, is it still a controversy sort of left, right? So she distinguishes these two. I'm going to use her term perspective, even if I'm so tempted to use hypothesis all the time. So I am the neuron stability sort of perspective, where the core claim, that has been built on the back of a lot of experimental and theoretical work, is that individual neurons, right, are computational units, functional units, because they have these stable, fixed tuning properties. So we can almost speak as if each neuron represents some specific parameter, kind of having to do with movement, something like direction or force or velocity. And that's what I kind of said. So kind of she tries to track how this perspective is built up across a lot of experimental and theoretical work, kind of showing how the key evidence is linked with the type of kind of methods, the single unit or small population recordings, right? And showing that actually, even if the individual neuron is the main actor here, basically you can hold on to this perspective even if you do population sort of modeling, right? So you can be kind of a population sort of neuroscientist and still sort of kind of hold on to that core claim. The other perspectives, right, she puts forward as kind of being the other perspective in the field, newer, and you see kind of by the kind of experimental and theoretical work, right? Core claim is that, look, if there are to be found kind of, representation, somewhere is going to be at the level of like population level, right? Only population level patterns are stable, and that stability is a very important clue that kind of those are going to be the computational representational units, whereas the individual neurons are just causally epiphenomenal, right? The methods differ, and kind of Mazviita also points out that, this sort of shift that we sort of see towards the population patterns perspective has been brought about primarily by the availability of these methods. I'm trying to, okay, it's going to be frozen. Yeah, we're fine. Should work. Yeah. Try it. Yes. Right? So I want to kind of look at this controversy through the lens of one question, right? So what's the controversy about, right? There are two core claims, but I want to sort of simplify it, right? So I think one way, and the first, like the entry point, right? The controversy is around this sort of question. Where does a particular part, so not the whole motor cortex, where does M1 represent movement, right? At which level? At the level of individual neurons, at the level of population patterns, right? But on both perspectives, we are stuck with this representational view. So M1 represents movement, right? So the disagreement, if I am understanding it right, and I always plead 19th century understanding, but the disagreement is that which neural structures bear representational content. So it's a question about the vehicles, right? Which are the vehicles? We're not there yet how exactly they do it, but like where should we look, right? So is it individual neurons or population patterns that carry information about movement? Right? And I kept looked at this, right? So is this a perspective, are these perspectives complementary, right? So I was kind of trying to map this debate, kind of reconstructing kind of from a kind of Mazviita narrative as well, right? And I kind of found that disagreement seemed to be substantive, right? So if you kind of look, do individual neurons have stable representational content? On the neural stability perspective, you have a clear yes. On the other, quite a pretty clear no. If you kind of look, okay, what about the causal, powers, of single neurons? Well, if you think about single neuron behavior sort of correlation, are these causally relevant? Again, you have quite distinct sort of views. If you want to ask what's stable, where is the stability found? Again, there is, well, at the individual neuron level versus at the population level. And then you kind of say, okay, if you kind of care about explanation, how should you go about trying to explain this? On the neural stability perspective, well, it's kind of the independent modulation of single neurons, so our explanations are going to be built around that. Whereas on the other perspectives, it's kind of more the sort of networks of interconnected neurons. So I'll kind of unpack this a bit more, but what I want to sort of bring, I want to contrast this way of kind of spelling the picture, as correct or incorrect as it may be, to what Mazviita is saying about it, right? these two perspectives on the motor cortex are in some respects complementary. This is the thing that kind of I kept returning to. Okay, are they? They each employ a different set of abstractions and idealization that have their own justification. I wouldn't disagree with that, they do. But one can be ecumenical so long as neither framework is interpreted as offering the final word on the workings of the motor cortex. So a lot I kind of agree on, but it's gonna look like I read only this passage in the book, but I'm gonna return on it because I think she packs quite a lot in such a tiny thing, right? But what I want to flag out of this, right? There seems to be a surface sort of interpretation where you say, okay, both are valid simplifications, right? Each presents the motor cortex in an appropriately simplified and hence noble way. And I know for her that connection there in the end between simplified and noble is very important, and I'm not going to make a lot of it, but I just want to flag. I know it's important. So the way I want to sort of flag the problem in a way, sort of start at a more conceptual sort of level, right? So kind of, I mean, I know pluralism is not kind of directly in the Mazviita's term, but I'm kind of reading it in a kind of pluralist way because of the complementarity, and I'll return to this point, right? But her perspectivism treats both frameworks as valid simplifications with their own justification, right? But then I kind of say, well, but if these perspectives or frameworks, see, I kind of slipped into using something else than perspectives, but if they make incompatible sort of claims, I'm kind of, my worry, and it might be misplaced, right? But I'm kind of asking whether treating them both as valid simplification risks maybe obscuring empirical inadequacy of one or maybe both frameworks, maybe even blocking error correction strategies if we just say they're both valid, and maybe conclude too quickly that both must be capturing something important or true about the target system, right? So I'm just saying, like, before we kind of go into kind of saying, yes, I'm kind of subscribed, I'm a card-carrying perspectivist, are both frameworks empirically adequate? And you might kind of say there's something there deeply wrong about the way I'm kind of framing the question here, but it's like I'm trying to bring kind of this sort of, how do I link it with kind of this question about empirical testability? How do I link it to the previous sort of claims, right? So if we focus, so that would be my focus, because this is the perspective that's in disgrace now, right? So the neural stability perspective is under attack. So I'll just take it as a victim, right? Mazviita herself sort of points out, right? She points out, like, look, it's like serious, like, work kind of pointing limits, right? She refers to the fact that individual neurons show this wide variety of activity patterns and instability as being the continual bugbear of this perspective. It also points out, well, you know, the population dynamics or population patterns researchers are very explicit that this is wrong. And then even right, applications like brain-computer interface that have been inspired by the neuron kind of stability perspective sort of give evidence against this perspective, right? So there is kind of feel, okay, quite a lot kind of against it, right? And one of the challenges that she discusses in the book, right, that is a direct challenge to the neural stability perspective is this phenomenon of representational drift, right? Which is the tendency of the neural activations that are correlated with task-related stimuli, actions, and cognitive variables, so plenty of these things, to change their targets, so the targets in the world, kind of the distal targets in the course of time, right? So that's the key finding. You have like these recordings in neurons in the mouse olfactory cortex over 32 days. And within a single day, right, the same neurons, or the same individual neurons showed consistent responses, but the recordings were done every 8 days, and 8 days later, the stimulus preferences had significantly changed. And since this study, and actually before the study, the phenomenon of representational drift has been documented and studied in other kind of individual cortex as well, and kind of other species as well, right? So there is, you know, experimental work out there, kind of trying to make sense of this in terms of the idea that the neurons might lack, and some will cut the might and just say just lack stable associations between particular neurons and, in the case of Schönover kind of study, specific odorants, right? So that's Mazviita interpreting the result, right? But in the way I read it, right, is like this kind of phenomenon and its study points towards something being terribly wrong with the neural stability perspective, right? Because it points to incompatibility, right? Can we, and I don't want to frame this as if like, you know, the research is finished, we know it's incompatible. I'm sure that there are kind of things that can be done to try to kind of recover this phenomenon within, and they have been done, right? But I just kind of want to say that even in Mazviita's reconstruction, there is quite a lot of emphasis on the incompatibility, right? Not on the complementarity, right? And kind of returning to the question about vehicles, right? If individual neurons, right, were stable vehicles, they shouldn't do this changing of their tuning, right? So the point that I want to make from this is that these findings are used to challenge the fixed tuning assumption. Are we all good? Yeah? Okay, so I think I need to wait for you to changing the slide. It's the activated one. Okay, there you go. Thanks. Okay, so again, returning to the way I kind of frame this controversy kind of debate, right, is I said, like, to start with, you can kind of view it as a question about the vehicles, where to find movement representations in M1, right? And again, it's kind of this sort of mapping. It's either there or the level of population patterns, right? And there seems to be lines of empirical evidence pointing that, you know, temporarily we have some sort of a winner, and I said the representational drift is one of the phenomena, and kind of the findings from studying this phenomenon sort of point that, well, one of the perspectives is sort of losing sort of traction. Also, as I said, the brain-computer interfaces sort of applications suggest that, well, you know, they were based on the hypothesis that the neuron stability was true, right? But what they kind of show, right, is that when you have these sort of perturbances, the brain kind of manages to reorganize itself to restore accurate sort of control. And the implication is that, well, you still have this functional stability despite of the fact that you don't have stability at the level of the individual neurons. So again, it's a little bit more indirect, but there's this sort of idea that, well, the population patterns might be those vehicles, right? And that's a question mark, right? So I'm not going to prophesize. I'm trying, even as a philosopher, we have this, oh, this is going to happen. I'm trying not to prophesize, so I put a question mark. But there seems to be kind of a bit like a pattern, right? More, you know, empirical work needs to be done. But what I want to sort of kind of flag is that the debate has the structure of empirical adjudication and not of complementarity, right? And this is where I'm kind of trying to say, like, what's my sort of like nagging feeling that there is something that makes me sort of a bit uncomfortable, right? With they're both valid sort of move, right? So again, that's a quote, right? This sort of implication that there are complementary simplifications, each valid in their own right? But what happens when one of these sort of perspectives faces persistent empirical difficulties, right? So that's kind of, again, another summary. Like, the evidence is that this bugbear is not going away. Does the kind of perspectivism, drop the first one, risk obscuring, right, these features of the debate and these empirical problems that we're still trying to figure out, but they're there? And is it saying that they both are valid in a way, sort of not allowing us to see them very clearly, right? So again, because now I'm kind of reading way too many historical texts and trying to sort of reconstruct this, I kind of try to do this also in the papers, right? Because the language, so I don't put a lot of importance on this, but it kind of, you know, it helps when you kind of feel, am I on the right track, right? To kind of feel the language is one of resolution. We need to resolve this rather than, these are two perspectives that can be integrated, or these are two perspectives which are complementary over these sorts of issues. I might miss something, right? But there is kind of course, I mean, you might say, oh, this is rhetorical packaging by the scientists. Of course, if you come with a new sort of perspective, you're going to say that the other ones are, you know, inconvenient truth, right? It's like, or that it's kind of, it's an alternative sort of thing, right? But I just also wanted to flag out that it stands out as a pattern that when kind of researchers looking into this area describe their work, it's a lot of the heated dispute, it's a lot of inconvenient truth, it's a lot of alternative. So that makes for me this idea of ecumenical acceptance hard to apply in this context. So I should say, right, I'm not kind of saying that this, and I'm kind of just disclosing my conclusion, but I'm not saying that this might not make sense in plenty of other right? Or plenty of other sort of periods, right? But I'm just kind of thinking, well, can you really be ecumenical about which assumptions to drop, or which theories have been shown to be sort of inadequate, right? So I was trying to sort of figure out where, if there is a sort of a slippage, right? So this is, and that's why that passage, one can be ecumenical so long as neither framework is interpreted as offering the final word on the workings of the motor cortex. And I feel like, sure, you know. And then kind of, so that's kind of from her setting kind of the whole sort of vision, but also in the chapter on that deals with the motor cortex, kind of Mazviita points out, the brain in itself is not noble in its endless Heraclitean complexity. I don't know about the Heraclitean, and I disclose that, I'm like so resistant. But no finite knowers would be able to theorize it completely and accurately as such. With the finite knowers not being able, much more comfortable. So the ecumenical sort of stance, what it suggests to me, right, is that, well, if we take on board this Heraclitean complexity, right, it does make complete understanding, whatever that is, impossible, right? So therefore, we should remain open. Maybe, I don't know how kind of comfortable your term pluralistic, but I kept peppering it. But at least view both perspectives as simplified bets or where to find stability. But I do think that there are two distinct issues, right? So the first issue that I agree with, like, no perspective captures the final word, right? All models involve drastic simplifications, and the complexity of the brain, Heraclitean or otherwise, might escape any single way of us trying experimentally or theoretically to get at it. And I agree completely that this supports a kind of epistemic humility, right, about how some form of final account of the brain or even of the motor cortex look like. If you're really kind of humble, we should say, even of the motor cortex, right? But I think that's sort of different, or at least I just kind of kept thinking, I kept changing my mind about this, but I kind of think it's a different issue from whether the core empirical assumptions that each of the perspective makes actually hold, right? And I'm kind of looking at this dispute, I just feel the dispute seems to be about that, not about the first sort of things, right? Dispute is like, do individual neurons maintain stable tuning? Are single neuron correlation causally relevant? Right, and these strike me as questions that we can at least try to go about, you know, try to get a kind of answer, not the final one, right? Right. So, and I said, in a way, you can see the whole debate as being just about where it is. So it's just you start with the vehicles. But again, I'd be surprised, right? I haven't done my proper sort of homework on this, but I can just have a hunch from what I understand, right? That it doesn't stop there, right? So it's not just questions about what constitutes a representational vehicle. Lots of this research tries to say, like, how? You know, how does it process this? Like, what is the organization here? What are the operations? So how does M1 orchestrate all the sequences of neural oscillations that cause not moral, but, you know, muscle contractions? How are representation processed and transformed to control behavior? Which transformations, even if kind of that's a little bit metaphorical, are involved in generating sort of movement, right? And again, returning to my pet sort of claim, right? It just seems that even if you switch the question from where to how, they seem to say, again, kind of how, well, something like movements are encoded in individual neuron firing rates, and the operation, the way it's like population vectors, sum these individual contribution, right? In the population pattern, sort of, look, hypothesis, it kind of how movements are generated via population trajectory through state space, and the operations are this sort of dynamic sort of evolution that we kind of represent in, not the brain, but we represent as scientists through line attractions or neural manifolds, or, right? So here is the, in a nutshell, right? So if we start from the assumption, right, sounds plausible enough, and I would want to just subscribe to it. Neural representations are just a simplification strategy that allows scientists to focus on these distal correlation, right? So you have neural activity, how it links to movement, while black boxing the underlying mechanism. My problem is like, well, it seems that the research definitely doesn't stop at identifying the where, so it doesn't stop at these distal correlation. There's definitely a project and kind of on both sides, right, to explain how, through causal organization or computational operations, depending which lab. and why does this matter? Why do I see sort of a tension? Well, how questions do require opening the black box, at least a little bit, up to which level I'm not going to commit to, right? But it's more than just noting that M1 activity correlates with distal movements, right? And I just think, okay, to capture this part of the practice might go beyond an account of representation solved simply as simplification, right? So kind of, if you want I don't see this as kind of a very strong sort of criticism against the big thesis of the book, but I'm just kind of asking, are all disputes sort of candidates for perspectivism or for pluralism, right? Should we just use that lens everywhere, right? Because it kind of, my look into the M1 case seems to be that, well, maybe in this case, this lens is not really helping us capturing what's happening, right? So kind of, I suppose my biggest worry is about this sort of blanket kind of pluralism that risks treating maybe empirically testable disputes as differences in perspective. Right, so I think there is quite a productive sort of program here, like when is perspectivism or pluralism the right answer, right? So I think we should ask ourselves, like pretty loudly, under what conditions should we embrace this sort of thing? And under what conditions we should kind of see adjudication or resolution, right, as being the way of looking. Says, what distinguishes genuinely complementary perspectives from empirical disputes that, just are on the verge of resolution? And right, when, if ever, representation talk goes beyond simplifying strategy to make substantive claims about mechanisms, right? So that's kind of what I'm kind of using to kind of just open kind of wider the conversation, right? Maybe, right? I don't know if this is a more vanilla sort of version, but rather than assume all scientific disputes are pluralistic, or all are, empirically, you can solve them, adjudicate them empirically. Maybe, like as a philosopher, we love so much coming up with normative frameworks, we can think about criteria for distinguishing cases where perspectivism is appropriate from cases where it might just prematurely sort of validate kind of a debate or validate even a specific empirically inadequate framework. Thank you.